The woman in 8A hadn't moved for 3 hours. Not once. While other passengers shifted restlessly through the turbulence over the Pacific, she remained perfectly still, her breathing so controlled it barely disturbed the navy blue scarf draped across her shoulders. The flight attendant had noticed her immediately during boarding, not because of the understated Patek Philippe on her wrist or the way she declined champagne with a slight shake of her head, but because of how she'd paused at the aircraft door, running her fingers along the aluminum frame like someone greeting an old friend. Now, at 41,000 feet somewhere between Tokyo and San Francisco, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom with an edge that made even the most oblivious passengers look up from their screens. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We have a situation developing. If there are any military pilots aboard, particularly anyone with combat experience, please identify yourself to the crew immediately." The woman's eyes opened. Not suddenly, not with alarm, but with the measured awareness of someone who'd learned to transition from deep sleep to full alertness without broadcasting the change. Her name was Valentina Dust Kowalczyk, though no one on this flight would know that name meant anything. Forbes had featured her twice, once as the aerospace executive who'd revolutionized drone navigation systems, and again when her company's valuation crossed $10 billion. They'd never mentioned the 7 years she'd spent in an F-16 cockpit over Afghanistan, or why her call sign had nothing to do with leaving others in her dust. It came from the dust storm over Kandahar, where she'd landed a Viper with no hydraulics and half a wing, saving not just her own life, but providing cover for a medical evacuation that saved 13 others. The flight attendant approached her row with studied calm, but Valentina had already unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood slowly, deliberately, her movements betraying nothing of the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. It had been 4 years since she'd touched a stick. 4 years of board meetings and acquisitions and careful image management. 4 years of pretending the sky was something she observed through office windows rather than something she'd once carved through at Mach 2. "Ma'am," the attendant whispered, though her eyes darted toward the cockpit door. "The captain needs to know, do you have flight experience?" Valentina reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather wallet. Inside, behind her driver's license and Black American Express card, was something she'd never removed despite her lawyer's advice. Her military ID, expired but still bearing the wings that had once defined everything she was. "Tell Morrison he has a Viper driver in 8A, she said quietly. 7,000 hours. Combat qualified." The attendant's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching relief, but Valentina was already moving toward the cockpit, her Hermes flats silent on the cabin floor. The cockpit door opened before she reached it, and Captain Morrison's face appeared, weathered, mid-50s, the kind of pilot who'd earned his stripes in the old days when flying was still as much art as science. His eyes swept over her designer clothes, the subtle diamonds in her ears, and for a moment she saw the doubt. It was a look she'd seen 1,000 times before, in briefing rooms and on flight lines, from men who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her capabilities. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but," he began, and she heard it in his voice, the polite dismissal already forming. "Captain," she interrupted, her tone shifting to something harder, more precise. "You've got a situation serious enough to ask for help over the intercom. I'm assuming that means your first officer is incapacitated, you're dealing with a system failure, or both. You have exactly 10 seconds to decide if you want to waste time questioning my qualifications, or if you want someone who's landed damaged aircraft in zero visibility conditions to help you get these people home." Morrison studied her for a heartbeat, then stepped aside. The cockpit was bathed in amber warning lights, and she immediately understood why he'd made the call. First Officer Daniels was slumped in his seat, conscious but pale, gripping his chest. Classic cardiac event. But worse than that, half the instrument panel was dark. Electrical failure, probably cascading. The Boeing 777 was flying on emergency power, and from the look of the weather radar, they were heading into a storm system that would test even a fully functional aircraft. "When did you lose primary electrical?" she asked, already scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. Morrison's doubt evaporated as he watched her eyes move across the panels, reading the story they told. 14 minutes ago. Started with a bus tie failure, then cascaded. We're on emergency power, but it's degrading. I need someone to handle navigation and systems while I fly. Valentina was already sliding into the first officer's seat as two flight attendants helped Daniels out. Her fingers found the controls with muscle memory that 4 years couldn't erase. You have a Viper driver as your FO now, Captain. My call sign was Dust. She began working through the emergency checklist, her movements economical, precise. That said, this Boeing flies like a pregnant whale compared to what I'm used to, so you'll need to talk me through the specifics. Morrison actually smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You military pilots all say that about commercial aircraft. Then you realize we're flying 300 souls, not just your own ass. Copy that, she replied, the military acknowledgement coming automatically. Through the windscreen, clouds were building, dark towers of cumulonimbus that would hammer them with turbulence. Lightning flickered in the distance. What's our nearest suitable alternate? That's the problem, Morrison said. We're 2 hours from anywhere with a runway long enough for a 777, and this storm system extends for 300 miles. Valentina nodded, already calculating fuel reserves, wind patterns, and descent profiles. The radio crackled with air traffic control, their voice tense with barely controlled concern. United 847, be advised, weather conditions deteriorating rapidly at all primary alternates. Recommend immediate descent to lower altitude to conserve fuel while we coordinate emergency landing options. Valentina keyed the mic before Morrison could respond. Oakland Center, United 847, we copy weather advisories. Request vectors to any suitable field within 150 miles. We're dealing with cascading electrical failure and need priority handling. The professionalism in her voice, the clipped military precision, changed something in the air traffic controller's tone. United 847, Roger. Stand by for vectors. Can you declare your fuel state? She glanced at the gauges, cross-referencing with the backup mechanical indicators. The electrical failure was affecting their fuel management systems, making accurate readings difficult. Oakland Center, we're estimating 40,000 pounds remaining, but we've lost primary fuel quantity indicators, running on mechanical backups. Morrison shot her a look of approval. She just told ATC enough to ensure priority handling without causing panic. In the passenger cabin behind them, 298 people continued watching movies, sleeping, or working on laptops, unaware that their lives now depended on a partnership between a career commercial pilot and a billionaire who'd left the cockpit 4 years ago to build an empire. You know, Morrison said as he fought to maintain altitude in the increasing turbulence, I flew with a lot of military pilots in my time, Navy mostly. They always wanted to tell war stories. Valentina was busy cross-checking their position against the weather radar, looking for gaps in the storm system. I'm not Navy, she said simply, and the stories that matter don't get told at cruise altitude. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cockpit in stark white. For a moment, Morrison saw her differently, not the polished executive who'd boarded in first class, but someone who'd lived in that lightning, danced with it at speeds that would tear this airliner apart. What's your plan, Dust? He used her call sign deliberately, acknowledging what she was beneath the designer clothes. She pulled up the emergency navigation display, her fingers flying across the degraded interface. We punch through the weakest part of this system here. She indicated a section of the storm that showed marginally less intensity. Drop to 25,000 to conserve fuel, declare emergency with San Francisco approach. The crosswinds will be hell, but SFO has the longest runway and the best emergency equipment. We can make it, but it won't be pretty. Morrison nodded. You understand this isn't an F-16. We can't just point and shoot through weather. We've got families back there. I've got family back there too, she said quietly, and Morrison noticed for the first time the thin gold band on her right hand, worn on the traditional Polish finger. My daughter's in 23C, she's 12. She doesn't know I used to fly. The admission hung between them for a moment before Valentina returned to the instruments. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is energy management. We need to trade altitude for airspeed efficiently. The turbulence hit them like a sledgehammer. The 777 lurched violently, and somewhere in the cabin, passengers screamed. Valentina's hands moved instinctively to the controls, supporting Morrison as he fought to maintain aircraft control. The storm was worse than the radar indicated, a massive supercell that had developed rapidly in the unstable air mass over the Pacific. "We're not going to make SFO," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "This thing is pushing us too far north." Valentina was already recalculating, her mind running through options at combat speed. In an F-16 she could have punched through or gone around, but the Boeing was a different beast entirely, massive, heavy, and burning fuel at an alarming rate with damaged systems. "Travis Air Force Base," she said suddenly. "It's closer and they have a 12,000-foot runway. Military field, but they'll take a civilian emergency." Morrison looked skeptical. "They don't usually." "They will for me," she said, already switching radio frequencies. Travis Tower, this is November 47 Alpha requesting emergency landing clearance for United 847, Boeing 777 with electrical failure and weather emergency. The response was immediate and negative. November 47 Alpha, Travis is a military installation. Redirect to civilian airfield. Valentina took a breath, then keyed the mic again. Travis Tower, this is Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Kowalczyk, former 555th Fighter Squadron. Authentication code Viper 77 Delta. I'm currently first officer on United 847 with 298 souls on board. We have cascading electrical failure and insufficient fuel to reach SFO through this weather system. Request immediate emergency landing clearance. The silence stretched for several seconds. Morrison watched her, saw something change in her posture, straighter, harder, the civilian executive disappearing entirely. "Stand by, United 847, came the response, and then after another pause, Colonel Kowalczyk, Travis Tower. "You're cleared for emergency approach runway 21 left. Emergency vehicles standing by. Welcome back to the pattern dust." The relief in the cockpit was palpable, but Valentina was already focused on the next problem. The approach into Travis would require them to descend through the worst of the storm, and with degraded instruments, they'd be flying partially blind. "Captain, I need you to trust me on something," she said, pulling up the approach plates on the backup display. "I've flown this approach 100 times, but never in something this big. You're going to have to be my hands while I'm your eyes." Morrison nodded. They were entering a partnership now, beyond rank or experience. Two pilots bound by the singular goal of bringing everyone home. The aircraft shuddered again as they entered the outer bands of the storm. Rain hammered the windscreen with such intensity that forward visibility dropped to near zero. The emergency electrical system flickered, warning lights cascading across the panel like falling dominoes. In the cabin, the flight attendants were strapping in, their faces professional masks hiding the fear that everyone on the crew must be feeling. But none of them knew about the woman in the cockpit. "United 847, turn left heading 240, descend and maintain 15,000. Travis approach control guided them toward the field. The controller's voice was different now. Valentina recognized the tone. This wasn't standard civilian ATC anymore. Travis had scrambled their military controllers, the ones who guided damaged fighters home. They knew who she was, or at least who she had been. The turbulence was relentless. The 777 pitched and rolled like a ship in a hurricane, its massive frame groaning under the stress. Morrison's knuckles were white on the yoke, his jaw clenched as he fought to maintain control. Valentina split her attention between the failing instruments and the view outside, using lightning flashes to gauge their position relative to the terrain she knew was below. "You're doing great, Captain," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Just hold what you've got. We're punching through in about 30 seconds. It was the voice she'd used with wingmen in combat, steady and assured even when missiles were in the air. Morrison responded to it, his breathing evening out slightly. They broke through the worst of it at 12,000 feet, but what they saw made Valentina's blood run cold. The electrical failure had been worse than they realized. The landing gear indicators were all dark. There was no way to know if the gear would deploy, and manual extension in a 777 was a complex procedure that required systems they might not have. "Morrison," she said quietly, "we might have to put this bird down on its belly." The captain's face paled, but his hands remained steady on the controls. A gear-up landing in a 777 had been done before, but rarely, and never in conditions like these. The crosswind at Travis was gusting to 40 knots. Rain was still hammering them, and they had one shot at this. "Travis Tower," Valentina radioed. "United 847 unable to confirm landing gear status. Requesting foam the runway and have emergency crews standing by for possible gear-up landing." The response was immediate. "Roger, United 847. Foam trucks are rolling. You're cleared for any runway you need. The field is yours." She turned to Morrison. "Have you ever done a gear-up in the sim?" "Once," he admitted. 8 years ago. You—" "Never in anything this big," she said, then added with a ghost of a smile, "but I did put a Viper down in a dust storm with no gear and half a wing. The principle's the same, just more airplane to worry about." Morrison actually laughed, a short bark of tension release. "Just more airplane, right." They began the approach, and Valentina started calling out the descent profile from memory, overlaying her knowledge of Travis's approach with the Boeing's performance characteristics. The rain had lessened slightly, but the crosswind was brutal, pushing them off centerline repeatedly. Morrison fought it with everything he had, while Valentina managed what was left of their systems, coaxing every bit of performance from the dying electrical system. 5 miles out," she announced, watching their position on the one functioning GPS display. "Gear handle down." Morrison reached for the gear lever, pulled it. Nothing. No sounds of hydraulic movement, no indicator lights, nothing. They exchanged a glance. This was really happening. They were about to attempt to land a 777 with 298 passengers on its belly in a storm. "United 847, Travis Tower. We show you on final. Runway is foamed. Emergency crews report ready. You're cleared to land at your discretion." Valentina keyed the intercom to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We're on final approach to Travis Air Force Base. We're experiencing a technical issue with our landing gear. As a precaution, we need everyone in brace position. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing." She kept her voice calm, professional, giving away nothing of the complexity of what they were about to attempt. In 23C, her daughter Sophia would be hearing this, though she wouldn't know it was her mother's voice on the intercom. Valentina pushed the thought away. There would be time for that later if they survived this. 2 miles, she called out. Airspeed 145 knots. Sync rate 700. Morrison was flying purely on instinct now, feeling the aircraft through the controls, anticipating the wind gusts before they hit. It was the kind of flying that couldn't be taught, only earned through thousands of hours in angry skis. 1 mile. You're doing beautifully, Captain. Just hold it right there. Through the rain, the runway lights appeared, beautiful parallel lines of white stretching into the distance, covered in white foam that gleamed in the emergency vehicle's floodlights. Fire trucks and ambulances lined both sides of the runway, their lights creating a corridor of red and white. 500 feet, Valentina called. Airspeed 140. Centerline looks good. The ground rushed up at them. Morrison began his flare, raising the nose to reduce their descent rate. This was the critical moment. Too high and they'd slam down, too low and they'd hit nose first. Valentina watched the radar altimeter, calling out heights. 100, 50, 40, 30, hold it, 20. The belly of the 777 kissed the foam-covered runway with a grinding shriek of metal on concrete. Sparks flew past the windows like horizontal fireworks. The deceleration threw everyone forward against their restraints. Morrison and Valentina fought together to keep the aircraft straight as it slid down the runway, using what was left of the rudder to maintain directional control. The noise was incredible, grinding, tearing metal. the roar of foam being displaced, and underneath it all, the twin engines still running, their thrust reversers useless without the weight on wheel switches that would never activate. "Kill the engines!" Valentina shouted, and Morrison's hands flew to the fuel cutoff switches. The engines spooled down, and gradually, impossibly, the massive aircraft began to slow. The 777 finally came to rest 3/4 down the runway, sitting on its belly in a sea of foam, smoke rising from the hot metal where it had scraped along the concrete. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then the evacuation alarm began to sound, and training took over. "Evacuate aircraft, all slides, all exits," Valentina commanded over the intercom, while Morrison began shutting down what remained of the aircraft's systems. The flight attendants were already in motion, doors flying open, slides deploying. 300 people began flowing out of the aircraft in controlled chaos, sliding down into the foam where emergency crews waited to guide them to safety. Valentina stayed in her seat, running through the shutdown checklist with Morrison, making sure everything was safe before they left. Only when the last of the passengers had evacuated did she finally unbuckle her harness. Morrison looked at her, extended his hand. "Thank you, Colonel, I couldn't have done that without you." She shook his hand, then surprised him by saying, "Yes, you could have. You're one hell of a stick, Morrison, I just helped with the navigation." They climbed out of the cockpit together to find the cabin empty except for the flight attendants doing their final sweep. Through the windows, she could see passengers gathered on the tarmac, some crying, some hugging, all very much alive. "Mom!" The voice came from behind her. Sophia stood in the aisle, her face pale but composed. One of the flight attendants had led her back on to find her mother. "Sophie," Valentina said, crossing to her daughter in 3 quick strides, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I'm okay, everyone's okay." "That was you on the intercom," Sophia said into her shoulder. "That was you flying." It wasn't a question. Valentina pulled back, looked into her daughter's eyes, her late husband's eyes, deep brown and endlessly perceptive. "Yes," she admitted. "That was me. Dad always said you were a pilot before. He said you were the best pilot he ever knew." Sophia's voice was quiet, wondering. "He said you gave it up for us, for the company, but that the sky never really let you go." Valentina's eyes burned with sudden tears. Marcus had been gone 2 years now, claimed by the cancer that had taken him in 6 brutal months. He'd been the one to convince her to leave the Air Force, to build something larger, safer. But he'd also been the one to insist she keep her licenses current, keep the military ID in her wallet. "Just in case the sky calls you back," he'd said. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the wounded aircraft. The foam was dissipating, revealing the massive gouge the 777 had carved into the runway. It would be closed for days, maybe weeks, but everyone was walking away. Morrison appeared beside them. "There's a bus coming to take everyone to the terminal. But Colonel, the base commander would like a word with you first, if that's okay." Brigadier General James Crawford stood at the foot of the aircraft, his flight suit crisp despite the rain that was still falling. Valentina recognized him immediately. They'd served together in Afghanistan, though he'd been a major then, running operations while she was flying combat air patrol. "Dust," he said, offering his hand. "When I heard your authentication code come across, I didn't believe it. Thought someone was playing a joke." The Valentina Kowalczyk I knew swore she'd never fly anything without afterburners again. "Things change, sir," she replied, accepting the handshake. She dropped the military honorifics years ago, but they came back now as natural as breathing. "Indeed they do." Crawford looked at the damaged 777, its belly torn open, its engines silent. "That was some piece of flying, both of you." He included Morrison in his gaze. "We've got the entire approach on radar tape. It's going to be required viewing at every aviation safety course for the next decade." Morrison stepped forward. "General, I need to be clear about something. Colonel Kowalczyk saved every life on that aircraft. I couldn't have managed the system's failures and the navigation without her. Whatever commendations or recognition come from this, she deserves the lion's share." "Respectfully, Captain, that's not accurate," Valentina interjected. "Captain Morrison flew that approach in conditions that would have challenged any pilot. I just helped with navigation and systems management. It was a team effort. Crawford smiled. Still the same dust, never could take credit for anything. He turned serious. The NTSB will want to talk to both of you, of course. But right now, there are 300 people who get to go home to their families because you two were on that aircraft. He paused, looking directly at Valentina. The Air Force never forgot you, Colonel. That landing in Kandahar is still taught at the weapons school, and now this. You know, we could always use good instructors. I'm retired, General, Valentina said gently. I have a company to run, a daughter to raise. But even as she said it, she felt something stir inside her chest, something that had been dormant for 4 years. Sophia slipped her hand into her mother's. Mom flies drones now, she told the general with 12-year-old authority. She owns the company that makes the navigation systems that guide them. Dad used to say she found a way to fly without leaving the ground. Crawford's expression shifted to understanding. Kowalczyk Aerospace, I should have made the connection. Your systems are in half our UAVs now. He stepped back, saluted. Well then, ma'am, thank you for your service, past and present. As he walked away, Morrison turned to them. Can I ask you something? Your call sign Dust. You said it wasn't about leaving people in your dust. So what was it about? Valentina looked at the damaged aircraft, then at the emergency crews working efficiently around them, the passengers being loaded onto buses, the controlled chaos of a successful emergency response. The rain was stopping, and breaks in the clouds revealed stars beginning to appear. It was Afghanistan, 2017, she began, her voice quiet enough that Morrison and Sophia had to lean in to hear. We were providing air support for a medical evacuation. Sandstorm came out of nowhere, the kind that turns day into night in seconds. The helicopter couldn't fly in it, couldn't see to land. 13 wounded soldiers were going to die if that medevac didn't happen. She paused, remembering the taste of sand in her oxygen mask, the way the world had disappeared into a brown void. I volunteered to fly low, below the storm layer, basically at ground level to guide them in. Used my aircraft like a shepherd dog, creating a clear air pocket in my wake. The sand and dust would swirl around my Viper but create a brief corridor of visibility behind me. The helicopter followed me in, landed using my jet wash as their guide. We got all 13 out. Morrison whistled low. That's insane, flying a fighter jet at ground level in a sandstorm. It was necessary, Valentina said simply. Just like tonight was necessary. You do what the situation requires with whatever tools you have. She looked at her daughter. That's what your father understood. Why he supported me leaving the Air Force but insisted I keep my skills sharp. He knew that sometimes the sky calls you back. A bus pulled up beside them and the driver opened the doors. Other passengers were already aboard and Valentina saw several of them looking at her through the windows. Word was spreading about who she was, what she'd done. Tomorrow, the media would descend. The story would go viral, the billionaire fighter pilot who saved a plane load of people. Her carefully maintained corporate image would be forever changed. You know, Morrison said as they boarded the bus, I've been flying commercial for 25 years, thought I'd seen everything. But tonight reminded me why we do this. It's not about the routine flights, the perfect landings. It's about being ready for moments like this. Valentina took a seat next to Sophia, who immediately curled against her side. Through the bus window, she could see the damaged 777 surrounded by emergency lights, a wounded bird that had carried them through hell and delivered them safely to Earth. Her phone was already buzzing with messages. Her board of directors, her executive team, all wondering why news reports were saying she'd been involved in an emergency landing. Tomorrow, she'd have to face them all, explain how the careful separation between her past and present had collapsed in one evening. But tonight, with her daughter safe beside her and 298 souls alive, because 2 pilots had worked together in crisis, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years. Complete. The bus pulled away from the aircraft, heading toward the base terminal where FBI, NTSB, and FAA officials were undoubtedly already gathering. The other passengers were talking quietly among themselves, processing what they'd just survived. Several were openly crying, the adrenaline finally giving way to emotional release. An elderly man across the aisle caught Valentina's eye. "That was you, wasn't it?" he asked. "You're the one who got us down safely." Before she could deflect or minimize, Sophia spoke up. "My mom's a hero," she said with the absolute certainty that only a 12-year-old could muster. "She always has been, she just doesn't like people to know." The old man smiled. "Well, the secret's out now, young lady. Your mother saved our lives." Others were listening now, turning in their seats. Valentina felt the weight of their attention, their gratitude, their need to understand what had happened. She'd spent 4 years in boardrooms where her military service was a footnote, a bit of background that added gravitas to her business credentials. But these people didn't care about her company's valuation or her revolutionary drone technology. They cared that she'd been in that cockpit when everything went wrong. "It wasn't just me," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Captain Morrison flew that approach in impossible conditions. The flight attendants executed a perfect evacuation. The emergency crews at Travis were ready for us. Everyone did their job. That's how we all walked away from this." But even as she deflected, she saw they weren't really listening to her words. They were looking at her with the same expression she'd seen on the faces of soldiers she'd provided air cover for, civilians in Afghanistan who'd watched her Viper circle overhead during tense situations. It was the look people gave to those who stood between them and catastrophe. Her phone rang her board chairman, Richard Steinberg. She let it go to voicemail. There would be time for those conversations later. Right now, she was still processing the fact that she'd been back in a cockpit, that her hands had once again helped guide an aircraft through crisis. 4 years of suppressing that part of herself, and it had returned instantly like it had never left. "Mom," Sophia whispered. "Are you okay?" Valentina realized she was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "I'm okay, baby, it's been a long time since I felt like myself." The bus pulled up to the terminal where chaos awaited. News vans were already arriving, their satellite dishes deploying like mechanical flowers seeking signal. Through the terminal windows, she could see officials in suits and uniforms, all waiting to debrief, to understand, to assign blame and credit for what had transpired. But first, she had something else to do. She stood up in the bus, causing everyone to look at her. "Before we go in there," Valentina said, addressing the passengers, "I need you all to know something. The media is going to want to make this about me, about my background, about the drama of it all. But Captain Morrison is the hero here. He kept that aircraft under control in conditions that should have been impossible. He trusted a stranger to help him, put aside ego and protocol to save lives. Whatever story gets told, make sure his name is at the center of it." Morrison stood up from his seat near the front. "With all due respect, Colonel, that's bullshit and you know it." The profanity from the professional captain shocked everyone, including Valentina. "You walked into that cockpit and took control of a situation that was spiraling toward disaster. You got us military landing clearance, navigated us through that storm, and helped me put that bird down when neither of us knew if we'd walk away from it. So no, I won't let you disappear into the background on this one." The two pilots stared at each other across the length of the bus, a silent battle of wills between two people trained never to seek glory for doing their job. Finally, Valentina smiled. "How about we call it even, Captain? We both did our jobs, we both went home." Morrison nodded. "I can live with that." As they filed off the bus, Sophia took her mother's hand again. "You're going to be famous now," she said. "Everyone's going to know who you really are." Valentina squeezed her daughter's hand. "I've been famous before, Sophie. It doesn't mean much. What matters is that everyone on that plane gets to have breakfast with their families tomorrow." They entered the terminal to a wall of flash photography and shouted questions. Valentina saw the NTSB investigators waiting with their recorders and notebooks, the airline executives huddled in urgent conversation, the base personnel trying to maintain order. But she also saw something else: the other passengers from Flight 847, some still in shock, others on phones telling loved ones they were safe. Each of them was a life that continued, a story that didn't end tonight on a runway in California. General Crawford appeared at her elbow. "There's a quiet room in the back if you need a moment before the circus begins," he offered. "The NTSB can wait 10 minutes. Valentina shook her head. "No, let's get this done." The sooner we debrief, the sooner they can learn from what happened. That's how we prevent the next one. It was the response of a professional, someone who understood that every incident was a teaching moment for the entire aviation community. Crawford smiled. Once a warrior, always a warrior, even in a business suit. As they walked toward the investigators, Sophia tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, does this mean you're going to fly again? Like, really fly?" Valentina stopped, knelt down to her daughter's eye level. "I never really stopped flying, Sophie," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I just flew different things. The drones, the company, even our life together, it's all been a different kind of flight. But tonight reminded me that sometimes the sky needs us to answer when it calls. Your dad knew that. He knew that taking the pilot out of the cockpit doesn't take the cockpit out of the pilot." Sophia nodded solemnly. "He told me once that you were born to fly. That some people are meant for the ground and some for the sky, and you were definitely sky people. We're all sky people, baby. Every human who ever looked up and wondered what it would be like to touch the clouds. I just got lucky enough to do it for real." She stood, and they continued toward the waiting officials. The debriefing would take hours. There would be recordings to review, decisions to justify, second-by-second analysis of every action taken in those critical minutes. But Valentina faced it with the same calm she'd once carried into combat missions. This was part of the job, the unglamorous aftermath of crisis. 3 hours later, the initial debriefing was complete. The NTSB investigators had been thorough but respectful, recognizing that both pilots had faced a nearly impossible situation and emerged successful. The preliminary assessment was clear: catastrophic electrical failure caused by a manufacturing defect, compounded by severe weather. The successful landing was being classified as exceptional airmanship under extreme circumstances. Morrison found her in the break room, nursing a cup of terrible government coffee. "They're arranging hotels for everyone," he said. "United wants to fly us all out tomorrow on a replacement aircraft." He paused. "They also want to know if you'll consider being on the crew for that flight. Apparently, the passengers are requesting it." Valentina laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "I don't think my insurance would cover that. Besides, I'm not current on the 777. Tonight was an emergency exception." "You seem pretty current to me," Morrison said. "Best first officer I've ever had, and I've flown with plenty." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two pilots coming down from the adrenaline high of crisis. Finally, Morrison asked, "What now? Back to the boardroom?" "Back to the boardroom," she confirmed. "Back to quarterly earnings and development meetings and all the things that keep my company running. But," she paused, considering, "maybe I'll also renew my flight instructor certification. Maybe volunteer with Civil Air Patrol on weekends. Sophie's old enough to learn now if she wants to." Morrison smiled. "The sky doesn't let go easily, does it?